The history of heavy.
Hello and welcome to episode 15 of the History of Heavy podcast, the show that traces the chronology of heavy music across genres, song by song. I am one of your two co-hosts, Michael Huntsman, and I am joined as always by my man up north, Mr. Big Daddy Dave Lieberman. Hello, Dave.
At your service.
How are you, my brother?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. My background is a little different. It's going to continue to be a little different for the next few weeks. I'm in the middle of a move. So we want to keep episodes going, but hopefully my audio and the video is good enough. I have these bad overhead cans that put a real awful glow on my forehead, but it will suffice for YouTube. And if you're listening on audio, why am I even mentioning it? So it's all good.
If you're listening on audio, what you need to know is Mike Huntsman is looking beautiful. He's just looking great right now.
I really am. I haven't aged a day. And speaking of not aging today, we're just coming off the Beatles episode, which was kind of an epic one. That one felt like I don't know to call it a milestone, but a big conversation to have as we go into the remaining 120 some odd episodes or whatever they are. But now we're starting to get into some real genre stuff. Beginning tonight with King Crimson, and it should be an interesting conversation. But before we get into that, we must get into the year of 1969. This is technically the second song. I Want You, She's So Heavy by the Beatles last week was in 1969, but you used that cultural corner to talk about the Beatles specifically. This time, I assume we're going to get into 1969, the year and all of its happening. So Dave, take us into your cultural corner and tell us about the year.
Dave's Control!
So once again, we have a year full of music to discuss. So Cultural Corner is going to be split up between a few months that we talk about in each of the songs. I did spend the time talking about the Beatles and the history of the Beatles in that episode because it's significant enough. And I'm going to do the same thing for Led Zeppelin because they are significant enough to spend that time on. And it helps me spread out the cultural moments, many of which were, again, dominated by Vietnam War, airplane crashes, Kennedy's being killed.
I don't mean
Robert
to laugh
Kennedy's.
at that, but yeah.
No, but I mean, it's like, it's weird how through this lens, I've noticed the proximity of these events are happening very close to one another. In this year, Robert Kennedy's killer is convicted, but in another year, he was killed, and this is the trial. In any event, we're just going to touch on a couple of highlights of 1969's culture in this moment. February 8th, after 147 years, the last weekly issue of the Saturday Evening Post is published in the United States. The magazine is later briefly resurrected as a monthly magazine. February 9th, the Boeing 747 jumbo jet is flown for the first time, taking off from Boeing Airfield at Everett, Washington. Meanwhile, across the globe, a month later, March 2nd, in Toulouse, France, the first Concorde test flight is conducted. And then March 20th, John Lennon and Yoko Ono. You may recall John Lennon from our prior episode um, a little band from Liverpool called the Beatles. John Lennon and Yoko Ono are married at Gibraltar and proceed to their honeymoon bed-in for peace in Amsterdam, where they stay in bed for peace. April 7th, an RFC series begins with networking group RFC1 on ARPANET host software. What the hell does that mean? Well, I'm here to tell you. RFC is a publication in a series from the principal technical development and standard setting bodies for the internet, most prominently the Internet Engineering Task Force, and RFC is a request for comment. It's submitted either for peer review or to convey new concepts, information, or occasionally engineering humor. Engineers can be funny from time to time. I don't care what the product team says about it. Engineers can be funny. And the ARPANET is the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network. And that was the first wide area packet switched network with distributed control, and one of the first computer networks to implement the TCP/IP protocol suite. Both technologies became the technical foundation of the internet. The ARPANET was established by the Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is now DARPA, the U.S. U.S. Department of Defense. I spent some time on this specifically because we're talking about the song 21st Century Schizoid Man. And with the Boeing 747, the Concorde, the ARPANET turning into the internet, this is a big prelude to the 21st century that we're living now. So I thought it was interesting to bring that into the cultural corner. And we're going to leave the rest of the year for the rest of our song list, and we'll divide that up and get into that in future episodes.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a great start to 1969, and after discussing the Beatles last week. The aforementioned 21st Century Schizoid Man was the first song on what many regard to be the first ever progressive rock album, that being In the Court of the Crimson King by London, England's King Crimson. That album was released on my very first birthday, October 10th, 1969, and reached number 5 on the UK charts. I guess my first birthday, but not my birthday. It was the most commercially successful of Crimson's albums and is considered by many to be the first true progressive rock album. It has been certified gold for more than 500,000 albums sold, and in 2015, Rolling Stone magazine placed it at number 2 on their list of greatest prog rock records of all time, just behind Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon. 21st Century Schizoid Man has been called the first ever alternative anthem, and is considered to be the band's signature song. Rolling Stone described it as a 7.5 minute statement of purpose, of rock power, jazz spontaneity, and classical precision harnessed in the service of a common aim, and an early example of heavy metal. Notably, 2 minutes into the song, there's an instrumental break that lasts for more than 3 minutes, and that break is titled Mirrors and is even listed in the song's title, which is actually 21st Century Schizoid Man featuring mirrors. That is essentially what makes the song, that mirror section of the song is essentially what makes the song a progressive rock song. The whole band in that section of the song is absolutely ripping, but in particular, Robert Fripp's guitar solo is absolutely amazing, and Ian McDonald's sax solo is absolutely jazzy. There is a lot of jazz going on in that section of the song, thanks to the saxophone. So that's where we're going to start with the conversation about Crimson and this song in particular. How, Dave, do you feel like 21st Century Schizoid Man fits into our chronology of heavy?
I think it fits pretty well. This is yet another band that I never listened to, although I've known about them for as long as I've been listening to music. For some reason, I just never crossed paths with the actual music. Um, I would later become later than now. When I first started listening to music and coming online and becoming aware of different tastes I like, finding prog rock and getting into it, fairly deep with Rush and Yes and Asia even. Um, but there's plenty more where that came from, and I feel like I only dipped my toe in the prog rock waters. This song is important in our conversation for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's heavy. It's got a great heavy riff that, with different instrumentation, could easily be a Sabbath riff. And in fact, I feel like I hear a Sabbath song in the break, like dun, dun, dun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hand of Doom is what it's recalling to me.
Yep.
But yeah, so this is heavy, and it's important to be in our conversation because it's heavy, and now we're branching again. Now we've got a prog rock branch.
Yeah.
So it's cool to see how this heaviness unites and spawns into its various branches.
Yeah, for sure. Did you get into much progressive jazz, let's call it, like Headhunters or Weather Report or any of that kind of stuff?
I did get into Chick Corea for a while, and was the band? It's escaping me now. I
Okay.
remember on a drive from San Diego up to the Bay Area in the middle of the night to avoid traffic on Highway 5. I was I was listening to some random SoCal jazz station, and I stumbled upon this jam. Um, After Forever, I think was the
Oh
name
yeah.
of the
Yeah.
name of
It
the
seems like that's one you would remember.
right. Uh, it was a long time ago, and I remember pulling over at a rest stop to finish the song that just wouldn't end. And I'm like, I need to hear who this is, because this is still, pre-internet, or this is going to be 95, 6, 7, somewhere in there. No, this is 95.
Right.
And so the internet exists, but just barely. And so as a callback to the cultural corner, the ARPANET and DARPANET that spawned the internet is in 1969 when this song comes out. And in 93, the internet goes public. And I'm in 95 listening to this prog rock in a moment in time where I don't know how to connect to it other than listening to the radio DJ announce who the hell it is.
Uh-huh.
And I hear who it is, and I immediately dove into some Chick Corea and some After Forever,
Yeah.
which was a moment in time for me. I was into Pink Floyd a little bit, but not as much as people around me were into it. I didn't get into a lot of the progressive jazz. Got too close to like David Sanborn and
Smooth, like cool jazz.
yeah, it got too much. Yeah, and it's interesting because one of the things that I didn't like about all that was this heavy use of alto sax, which is featured in this song.
Right.
And
So
I
this
thought that was interesting. That I was like, oh wow, it's rocking right here.
Right. So, well, that's why I wanted to bring up jazz specifically, because I think Crimson is kind of interesting. You've touched on a lot of the key players in sort of the progressive rock realm, but I do think you do have branches within that vibe too. When you talk about After Forever or Weather Report, um, that sort of stuff. that's clearly jazz, like heavily jazz influence, sort of capital J jazz. Then you have the Rush and the Yes part of it, which is more rooted in hard rock with jazz elements. Then you have sort of Pink Floyd and Genesis that have more psychedelia, but touch on jazz and hard rock, but are a little bit more psychedelia. I think Crimson sits kind of somewhere between the hard rock and the jazz. They're more hard rock than somebody like Headhunters, but they're less hard rock than Rush and more jazzy than Rush. So I think Crimson sits kind of a little bit in the middle, and there's something a little bit more sophisticated to me about King Crimson than than Rush specifically, but sort of their hard rock contemporaries. They seem a little bit more. They're almost the Steely Dan of this kind of music, which I think is either people either really love and gravitate toward, or they're really repelled by it.
But either way, I think that when you look at it as in that comparison, it's a level of technicality and music theory and genre style and tight playing that makes that definition match. It's not a matter of if you like it or not. It's does it conform to this particular standard of songwriting and song structure and construction.
Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the hallmarks of this kind of music, obviously, is unique time signatures, extended instrumental passages, lots of different parts, unconventional song structures. All of those things that are kind of rote in the jazz world, but are unfamiliar in a pop sort of rock world. And these guys are playing at a level well beyond what most of the artists we've talked to about at this point. I mean, Hendrix obviously is Hendrix and Coltrane is Coltrane, but even as talented as the Beatles are or were, they're not playing in a song like She's So Heavy the way King Crimson is playing in a song like 21st Century Schizoid Man.
Right. And as we're talking about it, I'm recalling players like Al Di Meola that I believe came out of After Forever, and like Pat Metheny, and like that whole prog jazz.
Yeah, Bill Bruford, Herbie Hancock. Yeah.
Well, and Herbie Hancock is an anomaly because he played with Miles Davis, and like he touches.
Miles even touches on this, right? We'll talk about a Miles song that fits into this canon. When we get into In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew, and Zuma, and Zuma's a Neil Young record, but when we get into all of that stuff with Miles, that's what he's doing, and Chick and Herbie and all those guys come out of, Miles was their boarding school effectively.
Yeah, for sure. So once again, the Venn diagram is not only crisscrossing genres, but it's three-dimensional, right? We're getting that with King Crimson. The use of the alto sax, I think, is really interesting because it's the only horn involved, and you typically have a horn solo, like a band that's around a horn player like Coltrane, or you have a horn section like Genesis or Tower of Power or Chicago, with trumpets and trombones, right? Like big kind of powerful. A sax is super powerful, but it can also be really subtle and breathy, like Stan Getz plays. And so I think it's a really kind of mature, complex instrument. And to have that be the only one involved, it's able to carry the weight of being the horn section in this song and being the only thing that's outside. It's the thing that ties it to jazz. Rock has guitar, bass, and drums, and jazz can have those things, but rock doesn't tend to have a sax. You got to go back into the 50s and some other anomalies to get saxophone and not heavy, right? It's more
Not heavy. Not heavy.
it's more it's coming out of the dance music of the 30s and 40s and the big band stuff that started to get crisscrossed and become rock. And so we're at a heavy moment, and we've got an alto sax, which I don't consider a heavy instrument, right? It's a high on the scale, and so tonally it's more bright than it is dark, but it is just the right thing to balance and give the other instruments a little bit of spice and depth. Now you can see higher, bad choice of words, but the alto gives us some altitude. We have some tonal altitude. So it makes the heaviness deeper because it goes down farther. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I want to talk about the heaviness and the curiosity of King Crimson being heavy, because I chose the song to be on the playlist, and I scratched my head still a little bit about it. To your point about saxophone and rock music, certainly, particularly in the 70s, with Bob Seger and Bruce Springsteen, and there were plenty of examples of quote unquote rock and roll bands that had saxophone players, but none that you would classify in this, large umbrella of heavy that we are interested in talking about. There are two things that I'm still trying to wrap my mind around as it pertains to Crimson, and why I think they're heavy, and why I haven't included Rush as an example on our list. We don't have a Rush song to talk about. Maybe we should. So let's talk about that for a second. So two parts of that are interesting to me as it relates to Crimson. That one is, we talked specifically on our Cream episode about what talented players they are, but how simplified they play in Sunshine of Your Love. That keeps it heavy. The simplicity is kind of what makes it heavy. The simplicity of I Want You, She's So Heavy makes it heavy. Inagata Devita, most of the songs we have talked about on this show. So 21st century Schizoid Man is anything but simple. It's very complicated and very busy. So how does that play into this? And then the second part is, back to the Rush thing. We think about heavy as well. I guess it's the jazz thing. We don't necessarily think of jazz as heavy. Coltrane being, we talked about Coltrane. We're going to talk about Miles. There's certainly heavy in jazz, but again, I didn't put Rush on our list. We're not talking about Yes. We're not talking about some of those sort of quote unquote progressive. We will talk about Mastodon, who you could argue is a progressive metal band. There's lots of progressive metal that we'll get into, but the stuff that leans more toward rock in the 60s and 70s that you would call progressive, I have mostly not included in our conversation, but I did choose to talk about Crimson, which leans more jazz. So just wondering, sort of, if you think about Rush as the comparison, and maybe you don't agree with this, but why does Crimson sound heavy, given how complicated and jazzy their music sounds, versus Rush, who to me does not sound heavy, with some exceptions, but really doesn't sound heavy with their power trio, rock leanings? And I guess it's unfair to ask that question of you, because you might not feel that way, but.
Well, I mean, that's why it's a fair question to ask, because it gives us something to talk about. I would say go listen to Working Man by Rush and talk to me about what's not heavy about Rush. It's definitely not their prog phase, but it's heavy.
Yeah.
And that's 1974, so maybe we're doing a little foreshadowing, and it could weasel its way in the conversation.
Creep in here.
It doesn't have to. The conversation that we're having is about the history and the development and the kind of evolution of heavy. And there's elements of this song that qualify, and it brings us it brings it into the conversation so that we can discuss it. Similarly, how Sister Ray is awfully busy and energetic, and there's a lot going on there, but there's a heaviness that underpins, and there is enough of an element of heaviness, and there's enough spark to bring it into this fire. And we're still talking about the early phase of this evolution. So things aren't fully defined as heavy yet. Elements are heavy. So that's why this song belongs in the conversation, and it's fair game for the conversation, and there's enough about it. And that gives us an excuse to wax poetic about the other stuff that's there that is also legit and interesting to know that those dimensions, those layers are being laid on those are laid on the roadmap for what will become heavy so that we can get to Mastodon. I don't think you get a Mastodon without a Sister Ray and without a King Crimson, unless you're breaking new ground then, and that's way in the future from here. Like it's not a direct line, but it's a line. Like you can connect it. It's just it's not a straight line, but it's a direct line. That's what I mean.
Does this song sound dated to you?
I would say yes, but not as old as it is. It doesn't sound like it's 1969 dated, which I think says something. It sounds like it's maybe early 80s kind of dated. Yeah, that's an interesting question.
I wonder if it would feel less dated if not for the sax. I'm wondering if the saxophone is kind of what dates it, because it does sound dated to me. I've known this song for a long time, but it's always sounded. We talked about when we talked about the Beatles, and in large part thanks to George Martin, how well that song and most of their music holds up. You've talked a lot about the nostalgia that the Beatles make you feel for the 60s. King Crimson sounds older to me, that the sonically the music sounds more dated to me than the Beatles song we talked about last week, but it doesn't sound of a specific time to me. You talked about the 80s. It came out in 1969. I don't think of a specific era. I guess if I had to pin it, I would probably sonically place it in the mid 70s somewhere, just because there was so much more of that kind of acid jazz and stuff going on then. But there's like, maybe it's kind of an almost otherworldly quality to the song. The production's a little thin, and again, the saxophone, I think, clearly it definitely carbon dates it to a degree.
Interesting. I want to ask you about what you think about the lyrics and the lyric effects, the vocal effects.
Well, the lyrics are kind of, famously, might not be the right word, but for lack of a better one, are about Vietnam.
Somehow, yes.
Right. I don't know if I would decipher that if I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Maybe at the time, maybe at the time it was a little bit more obvious. I like the lyrics.
There is one line that says "innocents raped with napalm fire."
There you
and
go.
It's 1969. So I think when you say napalm in 1969, there's a straight line to Vietnam.
Yeah, and we talked about when we talked about Fire by Arthur Brown, how the lyrics are really essential to making the song heavy, that the song isn't sonically heavy, but the stage presence and the lyrics were important to that. I think it holds true here too. I think, when people talk about Crimson being a precursor to heavy metal, it's not just sonically, but lyrically too. These are heavy metal lyrics.
Yeah.
One thing I really like, just from a kind of song writing perspective. I like how sparse the lyrics are. Like
Very sparse.
really sparse, and they still evoke a ton of imagery. They're really effective. I really like that. I don't love his voice, so I think the effect works well. You're not a huge hip hop guy, but this song was kind of famously sampled in a Kanye West song called Power that I have listened to a bazillion times in the past, 10, 15 years, whatever it has been since that song came out. Can't really talk about Kanye anymore in any good faith, unfortunately. But that line when he says 21st century schizoid man, that's in the chorus of this song Power. And I hear that every time. For as many times as I've heard the actual Crimson song, I've heard the Kanye song probably 20 more times than that. So I hear that where the effect on the vocal is really pronounced with a hip hop track underneath it. In this song, in the actual song, I actually wish the vocal was a little bit deep, like more of a baritone vocal. It's pretty slight, or not slight, but thin.
Tinny.
Yeah, tinny. Yeah, that's a good word for it. But the whole package I think is great. It took me you talked about hearing about Crimson and never, we all have those bands that we've known our whole life, and then finally we're like, I got to check this band out. We all have them. And Crimson was one for me for a long time, and whenever it was many years ago now, I finally checked them out. I was honestly a little disappointed when I first heard In the Court of the Crimson King, because I'm like, this is the album that everybody's making such a big deal about, and this is probably 25 years ago now, but it just kind of hit me in this way of like, I don't get it, and I discarded it for a long time. Yeah, it's not at the point that I was getting into it, I digested every form of progressive and alternative and heavy and math rock and every version of complicated music that in large part King's Crimson inspired. But then you hear the source and it's like, well, these guys are good players, but this doesn't sound like this big bombastic thing. But from that perspective, even though it does sound of a time to me, I think the record's aged incredibly well. Like, I definitely have loved it more and more and more with time than I did the first time I ever heard it.
What's your relationship with Frank Zappa?
I love Frank Zappa. Well, we do have a Frank Zappa song that we will be talking about. I sort of love Frank Zappa, who as a personality, as a talent, as a musician, the whole thing.
He's got my vote.
Yeah, he's incredible. His discography, I think any true fan will tell you, is real spotty. Like some of it's incredible. Hot Rats is obviously amazing, and Joe's Garage is amazing. He's got great records in his catalog, but he's also got some stuff that's pretty impenetrable, and some stuff that's just kind of he's fucking Frank Zappa. But I mean, we
can save that for that conversation, but I felt like there was, like, I heard like a tame Frank Zappa song here.
That's interesting.
Like I could get a very short trip from here to Frank Zappa.
I can't say I've ever really thought about that, but absolutely agree. I think the thing Zappa has that I can't think of any off the top of my head, but every band, every group we've talked about as progressive tonight, whether it's progressive jazz, progressive rock, psychedelic, whatever, every single one of those other bands is stone cold dead serious. And Frank Zappa had an amazing sense of humor. And I think that's one of the biggest things that separate, incredibly smart, one of the best musicians who ever lived, insanely talented, and fucking hilarious. Rush.
Yeah, and I mean,
yes, Genesis, Pink Floyd, King Crimson, none of those guys have an ounce of humor in them.
Yeah. Well, and like any of these, and I've seen so many of these Frank Zappa clips on YouTube Shorts and Instagram where he's serious as a heart attack. Like, he's talking some deep, political, social, religious stuff straight as an arrow. But like, dude named his daughter Moon Unit, um,
And his son Dweezil.
and his son Dweezil, right? Like this is the man's got a sense of humor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. King Crimson is an interesting one to me because In the Court of the Crimson King is the only album of theirs that I've really spent any time at all with. I listen to it really sporadically, but enjoy it when I do. They are when compiling songs for us to talk about on this podcast, they were an in from the very beginning. I think they're a really important cog in this machine, and I do really like them. They're just they're sort of kind of time and place music to me. Like I have to be in the right mood, I have to be in the right place, sort of thing, which isn't true of all of the artists we talk about on this show.
No, that's true for Frank Zappa. For me, it's not something that I put on a playlist.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and they've also had a huge cast, right? There's a ton of people who have played with them at some point.
Yep.
And for being around as long as they have, they don't have a huge discography. Respectable for sure, but like 69 was a long time ago.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. So is this the first time you've ever heard the song, or is it just not something you've listened to much?
First time I ever heard it.
So given what I just said about, my expectation leading up to Crimson, having heard about them your whole life but never listened to them, what was your initial reaction to the song?
It's interesting that you described this album as underwhelming because I had the same reaction. I'm like, this is King Crimson? This is the King Crimson? Maybe I had it. Maybe I was thinking of King Diamond. Like, is there another King? Maybe I'm thinking of Super Diamond. Like, where am I going here? And so I had to listen to it a few times before it kind of like, and as I often have to do with this project, I have to put myself in 1969. So I have to listen to She's So Heavy and then this, right? I have to listen to Cream and then this and Inagata Devita and like, okay, that's right. This is where we are. And what's the stepping stone we just were on? And now we're in motion away from that into a different place down this path that is unknown to these players. They don't know where we're going to go or where we're going to end up. And when I really put myself in that space, it has a more profound impact. It becomes more revolutionary because it is so not the Beatles or Inagata Devita or Cream and their blues style. Who else have we got here? The Kinks, Sonics, Stones, Coltrane, 13th Floor Elevators, Velvet Underground, Jimi Hendrix, Blue Cheer. It's not those, but it just stepped off that stepping stone and has some of that mud on its boots, right? It's still related, it's connected, and you can feel the connective tissue, but this is new. This is different, and it's bringing us with them to a new place.
Yeah, for sure. Well said. This song is a real clear indication that we are now in the era of the LP, because a band like this playing this kind of music is not in it for the hit single, right? They are taking people on a ride and all about the long form and all about the album and the whole experience. I mean, the Beatles certainly were as well, but most of the songs we've talked about so far were sort of, pop rock hits kind of thing.
Yep.
And released the singles. And, this was too, but, at 7.5 minutes with a 3-minute instrumental break, this wasn't exactly screaming to be played at the sock hop.
And to your point about the LP era, an album, we made this point before, this is a time when albums were, there was an architecture to an album, and this is the album opener. Like you open the door into this band, into this room with this album, with this song. And that's not insignificant either. They're not going for the pop charts, they're going for the art. We have something to say. This is how we're going to say it. And if it connects with you, you're in our tribe. But this isn't like, please connect with us.
Right. The other thing, it feels like it feels very adult. You know, we've
Oh,
talked
yeah.
a lot about the teenager in our early
Yes.
episodes, and with the exception, really, the Beatles and this song are really being played for adults, which
Yes.
has not been the case up until really 1969, at least in the songs we've been talking about.
That's very true. And I'm glad you brought that in, because one of the things that one of the words that I felt described this was earnest. Like this is,
Very earnest.
it just feels like this is sincere, earnest, intentional, architectural music. The song structure is really complex, but they're tight. There's a looseness to the soloing part, but it's tightly bookended. It flows. It's really, it takes a lot of talent and a certain mind to build a song like this. Sunshine of Your Love, there's something to it, but it's emotion, right? And it's
Yeah.
a less is more kind of a thing, where it's just down to the bare bones and you feel it. But this song, and what a defining characteristic I think of prog rock is, as you feel it, you think about it, and it's making you think about it, and
It's
it's
art.
making you. It is art,
It's art. Yeah, it's
but
art.
it's happening as much in your head as it is in your emotional, in your gut.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. Yeah, and results may vary when you walk in that. Specifically with music, I think results may vary because music is so innately emotional.
And I think that prog rock in general has a very high variability rate there, because you get bands like Rush and like After Forever and Pat Metheny and what is it, Fatburger. Like there's all these. It went all over the place. Weather Report,
Yep.
and so you kind of step into this very squishy, undefined genre that's almost defined by its lack of definition. It's just sort of corralled by this intentionality, talent, very high talent, and a lot of structural elements. There's a lot of composition and a lot of theory that's happening in here. And so it's like a musician's music, like I remember watching an Anthony Bourdain, and I may have mentioned this on this podcast in the past. This has come up in conversation before, so forgive me, audience, if you've heard this one. But there's this Anthony Bourdain episode where he meets with these other chefs at this like somebody's table. It's this like underground restaurant at like 1 a.m, and they're having a sheep's head, and they're like all agog about this sheep's head. And I'm like, there's a point when you've had the truffle fries to death, and you've had the delicacy of delicacies, and it's just not interesting anymore. And it can be good. It's just not new and not interesting. And so this sheep's head, he was all into it. And it's like, wow, that's pretty extreme for me. But like I haven't reached that point, right? And a lot of this music, prog rock, is like the sheep's head of music, where other instrumentalists are hearing texture and depth and music theory and scales and juxtapositions and progressions and time signatures that I'm not privy to. I know that they're there, I just don't know how to digest them. And so it's interesting because I know that some of that is here, but I can still digest this.
Yeah, look, there's a difference between enjoyment and appreciation. And
Yes.
when those two things cross is kind of the pinnacle. And if to trace your analogy, if prog rock is the sheep's head, then punk rock, which will happen, I mean, as early as the Stooges and the MC5, but really the punk rock explosion of the late 70s is the reaction to the sheep's head. So punk rock becomes the cheeseburger, right? We want to go back to the cheeseburger. We've got a little while to get to punk rock. We will talk kind of about sheep's head next week, not exactly, but kind of a form of a sheep's head. We will get into that in a minute. But first, we have to talk about song v song. Every week we pick, we talk about last week's champion and put it up against this week's song. Dave and I both hold the same current champion. That is the aforementioned Beatles. I Want You, She's So Heavy. Dave, how did King Crimson fare for you in the fight against 21st Century Schizoid? What man?
Definitely interesting, new flavor. I'm interested in it, but the Beatles is my cheeseburger. I'm keeping it.
Yeah, I think the Beatles is a good example of that collision, right? The sort of appreciation and the emotional reaction that I described. So for me too, I mean that the Beatles is going to be tough to beat. So both of us hold the same champion. We will take that song into next week, where we will get into the rock gods themselves. We will be dazed and confused with Led Zeppelin next week. So that should be a very fun conversation. But that's it for this episode. We went a little bit long, but probably applicable for King Crimson. So thanks for listening. And Dave, as always, that was a fun conversation. Stay heavy, everyone.
Always a pleasure. Okay, thank you. Bye.